Greetings, hounds of horror, and welcome to Horror Beneath the Surface, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the inner workings and mechanics of the horror genre at large, including, but not limited to, books, films, and television. I am your host, Professor Terror, otherwise known as Mark. Stick around. Today's episode, submitted for your approval. Can you call the Twilight Zone a horror show? Act 1, The Morgue. In Stephen King's book, Danse Macabre, he posits that the Twilight Zone only had one true horror episode. I present 5 additional episodes that refute that concept, as well as review the one episode that he considers horror. Act 2, The Eulogy. A look at the man behind the Twilight Zone, his life, and other anthology TV show, Night Gallery. Act 3, The Obituary. When it comes to the Twilight Zone, you'll find the majority of the iconic episodes belong to around 3 writers. We take a look at the other 2 masters of the twisted tale, Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont. Today's episode of Horror Beneath the Surface is brought to you by Pine Tree Audio. Working on an audio project that's not going quite right? Audio cables letting you down? Pine Tree Audio designs and handcrafts audio solutions at the highest level of quality, providing customers with passive preamps, speaker selectors, power supplies, and filters, speakers, power cables, auxiliary cables, and more. Visit Pine Tree Audio on the web today. Act 1, The Morgue. A few years back, I finally got around to reading Stephen King's 1981 nonfiction book, Danse Macabre. The book was a meditation on the horror genre at large, and King was asked by his editor if he would write it. King throughout his career has occasionally bristled at the notion that he is a horror writer. He considered his work more suspenseful with a supernatural bent. Most King fans will probably recognize that this title fits his work better, or at least the majority of it. The novel It was at least in part inspired by the notion of, if they're going to call me a horror novelist, then I'm going to write a full-tilt, pedal-to-the-metal horror novel. In truth, it doesn't really matter. King's work has novels, novellas, short stories that very, very much fit the designation of horror. And others do not. For every It, Pet Sematary, and Salem slot, you have a Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, Dolores Claiborne, and The Gunslinger. In 1981's Danse Macabre, King eventually discusses the Twilight Zone. In it, he says that the Twilight Zone was a collection of morality plays, and that the only true horror episode was one called The New Exhibit. This gave me pause when I read it. In some ways it's largely true. Twilight Zone usually featured a fable or a moral wrapped up in a sci-fi or fantasy concept. This has been true for a lot of shows, especially around that time. This is the early days of TV, and you can't exactly have episode of blood, guts, and gore and killer Santas as much as you'd want them. TV was free back then. The only price of admission was a TV set and some adjustable rabbit ears. Ads played for shows' production costs, and advertisers did not like to upset the apple cart. Big ad firms liked the status quo. Rod Serling, creator of The Twilight Zone, did not like the status quo and discovered that if you took your moral or message and presented it cloaked in sci-fi, TV censors and advertisers either didn't understand it or didn't care. Take, for example, a show that came a few years later after Twilight Zone was cancelled, Star Trek. In a classic Season 3 episode of the original Star Trek, the Enterprise picks up an alien half of whose body is white and the other half is black. They then encounter another alien of the species who claims to be looking for the man that the Enterprise has picked up. All is well until the second alien starts talking about how inferior the first man is. Captain Kirk and the rest of the crew are confused. The alien then points out that his black half is on the other side, the wrong side, and is therefore inferior. You get the idea. The allegory is about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. TV censors at the time didn't get it. I don't know how they didn't get it, but they didn't get it. This is the era of civil rights. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. In no way, shape, or form would television network have allowed a show to discuss such racism in that frank of a way. However, if it's a green alien being racist against a blue alien, suddenly the network sees nothing. No problem. This is not a Star Trek podcast, but The Twilight Zone was among the first shows to pioneer this storytelling technique in order to avoid upsetting the apple cart, but also imparting a message to its viewers. So, back to horror. As King stated, and I said prior, The Twilight Zone was largely morality tales. For example, the episode Time Enough at Last features a be careful what you wish for message. We follow the great Burgess Meredith, the Penguin on the 1966 Batman TV show, Mickey from the Rocky movies, as well as a handful of Twilight Zone episodes. He is a man that works in a bank and hates how busy and loud the world has become. He simply wishes to be alone and read. Who among us cannot relate to that? A nuclear missile strike hits when he happens to be in the bank vault. He is now the last man on Earth. He finally has enough time to sit and relax and read all the world's great literature. However, right before he begins, while reaching for a book, his glasses fall off his face and shatter. He is now effectively blind. He has gotten what he wished for, to be alone and to read. Of course, now he has no way to read. While there is a horrific element to the story, the idea that now he is trapped, ostensibly blind, in a desolate wasteland, is a terrifying prospect to the bespectacled among us. The terror part of the story is more a piece of the be careful what you wish for narrative. It's not a true horror story, it's a story that has a scary element. There are a lot of episodes like this. The two rich men who are constantly arguing make a bet that one of them can't stay silent a whole year, and if he does, the one man will give the other one $1 million. The man staying silent agrees to stay in a small glass apartment in the rich man clubhouse to be under constant surveillance so that he doesn't cheat. He wins and makes it the year. The other man who bet him makes a confession that he has gone broke and cannot pay him. The silent man makes no noise, even after this confession. He writes down on a piece of paper that in order to win the bet, he had his tongue surgically removed. Of course, there will be no $1 million, and he will never, ever be able to speak again. If I remember correctly, King brings this story up in Danse Macabre and says that it feels like more of an episode of Twilight Zone competitor Alfred Hitchcock Presents. I agree with him. Hitchcock's show was more of a crime show, although it did itself occasionally veer into horror. I like Time Enough at Last, that's a classic. I like the Tongue episode, which I believe was called The Silence. But neither of those would I consider horror stories. So which episodes would I consider to be horror? Let's start with Season 1, Episode 1, Where is Everybody? Our story begins in a small Midwestern town. A man strolls into the town and sees a gas station and a diner. There is loud music coming from inside. When he goes into the diner, however, no one is there. He attempts to find somebody, but can't. There is a tea kettle on the stove and pies in the oven, but no one around. The man pours himself coffee. He seemingly has amnesia. He doesn't really remember who he is. He claims he will wake up any minute now. He leaves the diner and heads further into town. It is typical small-town America with a main street and a hardware store. A clock bell rings in a tower. However, no cars and no people. It's deserted. Deserted, but not disheveled. Our main character continues to look for folks. It seems as if everyone in town has vanished in the blink of an eye. It is then that he spots a woman in a car across the street. He approaches while talking to her, telling her of what he's found, or what he hasn't found. He says that he woke up and couldn't remember who he was, just found himself walking. The woman gives no answer. He gets closer to the car and finds that the car had the mannequin of a woman in it. He opens the door and she falls to the street, fully dressed, but just a mannequin. Once again, he continues his search, and the town is dead silent and still deserted. Our character begins to get the picture. That is until the phone starts ringing in the booth across the street. He grabs the phone and nothing. No one on the other end, no dial tone, no operator, nothing. He puts a quarter in and gets an automated message that the call could not be connected. This leads to a bout of paranoia and fear. He looks around again, nothing. He attempts to leave the phone booth and finds himself locked in. Still no one around. He finally manages to get the door to open, and he walks into the police department. It is now that he vocalizes that he gets the feeling that he's being watched. He sees smoke and looks over to see a smoking cigar sitting in an ashtray, and a desk across the room. He goes into the jail cell area and still sees no one. There is more evidence that it seems like everyone just vanished. Wherever they were and whatever they were doing, they simply vanished in the middle of doing it. He runs back into the center of town, screaming and asking where everyone is. That's where they got the title. He walks around and the church bell rings again. He checks the drugstore. He helps himself to an ice cream at the drugstore ice cream counter. Man, drugstores were so much cooler in the 50s. You could walk in, get prescription cocaine, and then grab an ice cream sundae. What a time to be alive. He looks in the mirror and still does not recognize himself. He is convinced that he is in a nightmare from which he cannot wake. He tries to talk some courage into himself, and he gets a bit calmer, and then a little depressed. While walking out, he stumbles upon a book rack with copies of the book Last Man on Earth, written by Richard Matheson. Hey, doesn't he write a bunch of episodes for this show? Yes, he does, but this is episode 1. We are getting ahead of ourselves. More on Richard Matheson later. He sits on a park bench for a long time. It gets dark, and then all the streetlights begin to come on, and this startles our main character. The theater's marquee begins to light up and flash. He walks towards it and into the theater. They're showing an Air Force movie, and this triggers something in our main character. He looks down at his jumpsuit and says Air Force to himself. He realizes that he is in the Air Force and rushes into the theater. The seats are all empty. He starts to rationalize his situation. There must have been a bomb, that's why there's no people. But nothing is destroyed. No ruins, no rubble, everything is untouched. The movie begins and the lights go down. He yells up to the projection booth. He then runs up to the booth to find it empty, but the movie is still playing. He runs down the stairs into the lobby, and suddenly reality cracks. He has run into a mirror. It's a cool effect. He gets up and stumbles back into the town square, breaking into a run. He is hysterical now. He starts repeating over and over, "Please, somebody help me." Then we see a dark room full of men in suits. They are expressionless. Watching on TV our main character, who is sitting in a chair with electrodes on his head. A hat lying on the table in the room of men confirms that it's the military of some sort, probably the Air Force. The head military guy stands up and tells one of his minions to release our main character. They walk over to a small box in the middle of the warehouse room and open the door to the box. Our main character has been inside the box the whole time. This has been an experiment of some sort. He has been in there for 484 hours and 36 minutes. Newspaper men flood in and begin to question the general. The general says the mission was a success. This is supposedly a simulated, isolated trip to the moon to see how a man would respond to the confinement and the solitude. We as an audience have witnessed the breaking point. Our main character now, on a stretcher, talks to the commander and tells him that he feels a little better. The expression on his face, however, betrays this sentiment. He claims that he never wants to be in this place again. He says something that has haunted me to this very day from the first time I ever saw this episode. Next time, it won't just be a box, will it? To which the commander replies, next time, you'll really be alone. The end. On the surface, this episode deals with a military experiment to see about a manned expedition to the moon. While yes, that is the surface of this episode, one, I don't really buy it, and two, the concept and execution of this episode is pure horror. Simply imagine waking up and finding that everything in the world was still there except people. No rubble or signs of some disaster. The last man on Earth, doomed to live out a solitary existence in a world that oddly still functions. Streetlights still go on, phone calls can still be made. Granted, there's no one to answer them. No people, just the streetlights coming on and off, jukeboxes still working, let alone wandering through this existence with amnesia. This is the horror of existing in the world. There is also a lack of control and a paranoia element. This entire episode he feels he is being watched. And he is right. At the time in the middle of the episode, we don't know it, but by the end we do. It's a creepy feeling to be alone but feel as though you are not. This episode conveys that feeling excellently and terrifyingly. There is no moral to the story that I can find, really. The message on the surface seems to be that man needs companionship, but that is kind of weak sauce, if you ask me. This was the first episode of the first season of the Twilight Zone, and right from the get-go we see a very common Twilight Zone theme. This is Cold War paranoia and fears of mutually assured destruction. In the episode he mentions the bomb, but dismisses it. I put forth that this was an experiment by the military to examine the effects of solitude on the survivors of a nuclear attack. I think the moon landing story was just a cover. It is because of that section in the middle he says the bomb. We don't have to ask what bomb. Even today we know what the bomb means. Nuclear annihilation. Knowing Serling's writing and future episodes' themes and messages, I don't think this was coincidence at all. Whether conscious or unconscious, this episode teems with Cold War paranoia. It is also quite terrifying. The end message is not we have to work together and overcome our differences. The message is next time, it'll be real. So, horror or not, what say you? You may not have agreed with the first pick, but the next episode logic is airtight. Terror at 20,000 feet. Captain Kirk himself, William Shatner, is seated on a plane with his wife. He is seated in the emergency row, and he looks a little nervous at the emergency door hatch that has a latch to be pulled in case of incident. He is nervous, fidgety. His wife tried to reassure him that the doctor told him he is cured and would not have cleared him for flight if the doctor didn't think he was ready. He lights up a smoke on the plane because it's the early 60s and it's illegal not to smoke on a plane. He lightens up a little, realizing he's simply nervous. It's been 6 months and we never really know what he had specifically, but Serling's intro says mental breakdown and he was institutionalized. He has missed his wife and kids and feels bad for having left them. His wife reassures him. When the pilot locks the door, the Shatner gets a little jumpy again. He then half-jokingly admits that it's not the airplane itself, it's just him feeling rather non-confidant. The flight takes off. Shatner tries to gut it out. Everything goes okay for a while. The stewardess goes around checking on everyone, telling them to buckle their belts. The plane is flown into some thunder and rain. Shatner peers out the window and sees the wing and thunder and rain. That's when he sees something on the wing in the shape of a man. He looks back to his wife to wake her up and turns back to the window. Nothing. The next glance at the window, the creature is back and has gone for one of the engines. Shatner is confounded and nervous, understandably so. He looks around to see if anyone else has seen this or noticed. The plane is calm and quiet. He rings the stewardess, and the creature is now even closer to his window. He tells the stewardess that there is something out there, and she seems confused and surprised, understandably so. Shatner looks back out and sees nothing. So does the stewardess. He seems embarrassed, and the stewardess asks if she can get anything for Shatner. Shatner's wife has now woken up. Both the stewardess and Shatner play off the incident, and the stewardess shuffles off to get him something. His wife shows some concern, and Shatner simply claims he's overtired. She offers him a sleeping pill, and he accepts. The stewardess comes back with a cup of water, and Shatner takes the pill and the water. His wife goes back to sleep, and Shatner, normal but nervous, tries to relax. The curtains for all the windows on the plane have been pulled. However, it starts to eat at him, and he contemplates pulling the curtain. He slowly tries and hesitates. He pulls the curtain, and the creature's face is right up against the glass. He screams and shakes his head, muttering to himself that this isn't real. His wife is still asleep. He once again asks for the stewardess, and the creature leaps out of sight at a very convenient time. The stewardess wants to know what he needs, and he asks if they're heading into a storm. She assures him that it's fine, nothing to worry about. He closes his eyes and tries to wake his wife. The creature on the wing descends back down and starts to mess with the propeller. Shatner looks on, terrified. The creature begins to mess with a panel on the wing and pulls it up to reveal the wires and the cables. He again tries to wake his wife calmly, and both look out the window. Again, the creature jumps off the wing and out of sight. His wife starts to think maybe this is a result of the stress. After all, he just got out of the loony bin. He calmly and rationally tries to tell her that there is a man on the wing. She looks at him as though he's crazy. He starts muttering about the war and what the pilots called gremlins. It's not a man on the wing exactly, it's more like a gremlin. He realizes that his wife thinks he's gone off the deep end again and doesn't believe him. She tries to talk some sense into him, and that only makes him angry. She begins to try and calm him, and in a sing-songingly kind of patronizing way, tells him it's probably just stress. He begins to question himself, but seems certain that this event isn't another breakdown or delusion. Shatner gets more impatient, angry, and insistent that the gremlin on the wing is reality. He pleads with his wife to go tell the pilots, and if they check and see no gremlin or damage to the wing, if they do, then he is right. If the pilots don't see anything, he promises his wife he will recommit himself as soon as possible. He needs to warn the plane of the gremlin and the damage. She agrees to tell them and leaves her seat. He is seemingly relieved, and his wife does actually ask for the pilot, or at least one of the cockpit guys. Another glance at the window sees the creature back on the wing and going for the wires and cables. Shatner starts to yell for the guy so he can come and see. The pilot guy runs over, and Shatner tells the pilot guy the story and to look. The pilot guy sees nothing. The wing appears normal, no damage to either engine. Nothing out there but rain and dark. The pilot is less than enthused and doesn't believe Shatner. He tells him that he should stay calm, and the pilots have seen it and they know about it. They are trying to keep it quiet so as not to cause a panic. Shatner says he understands and is elated at first, but then comes to realize they are lying to him. He doesn't let on. Shatner has another moment of doubt. While Pilot Guy and Shatner's wife conspire to drug him for the rest of the flight, another glance out the window sees the creature pulling at the panel again. Shatner considers yelling again, but tells no one. The creature continues to damage the plane and flies away again as wifey drugs Shatner. He takes it, and his wife is instantly relieved. She assures him that he will sleep, and he fakes it. When his wife isn't looking, he spits out the pill. The gremlin is now back on the wing, actively dismantling the engine of the propeller. Looking around, Shatner sees there is a police officer on board who is asleep and has a gun. This is his chance. He takes the gun, pulls the emergency hatch, and begins shooting at the gremlin. He is being sucked out of the plane as the passengers scream and the flight crew tries to pull him back in. He gets off a few shots and seemingly manages to hit the gremlin. On the ground, the plane is landed. Shatner is strapped down to a stretcher and is about to be hauled away back to the insane asylum. He's alive. As we get to see him loaded in the back of the ambulance, the captain of the flight thinks it was a suicide attempt. The camera pans out and up, and we see the wing of the plane, damaged right where the gremlin was. The end. Right off the bat, this story is pretty straightforward. No allegory to Cold War America or moral to be found. Flying can be scary for a lot of reasons. Missing luggage, fear of heights, crashes, getting on the wrong plane as a kid while your family goes on vacation in Florida, and you're in New York with the credit cards and the money, and then you run into the wet bandits again, and... okay, that last one was Home Alone 2. But there are a lot of reasons to fear flying, and many people do. But imagine seeing something monstrous on the wing trying to damage the plane. That's terrifying. The monster could cause the plane to crash and kill everybody, or maybe it gets on board and tries to kill people. Obviously, you have to try to do something to save the plane, but no one is going to believe you. Trying to do this is hard enough without also having had a recent mental breakdown. Also, you could question your own sanity. On the one hand, you might be the crazy guy. On the other hand, your inaction could kill everyone on board. These are high stakes and a horrifying prospect. The other point is, obviously, this also means monsters or gremlins or whatever the monster is on the wing. Those things exist in reality. When I saw this episode as a kid, I took it at face value. I trusted the Shatner character. Also, being a young Twilight Zone fan, the show featured aliens and monsters all the time, and that was a big appeal to me. I love them. The episode, however, is played on two different levels. The one level is superficial, and you can take Shatner's character's experience as truth. He's seen this thing on the wing, he's trying to warn people, no one believes him. He has flown into the Twilight Zone and come in contact with a monster. The other version, the subconscious version, is that Shatner's character is unreliable, and has a deep fear of flying as well, as whatever caused him to have the breakdown in the first place. He is also nervous that he wasn't cured. The plane was flying through a storm, and the damage to the wing could either be imagined by Shatner or real, but as a result of the storm. I choose to believe that even though Shatner's character did have mental health issues, the gremlin was real. Imagine how terrifying that is, and no one's going to believe you. Before I go on to the next tale, I will also take a minute to discuss a small amount of trivia for this episode. Aside from Shatner, Captain Kirk himself, also T.J. Hooker and Boston Legal and a bunch of other things, this episode was written by none other than Richard Matheson. See, I told you we'd get back to him. That is still a ways off, but he wrote this story. Terror at 20,000 Feet was directed by Richard Donner, who cut his teeth in classic television, but went on to direct horror classic The Omen, the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, then went on to make the Lethal Weapon movies, Goonies, Scrooged, and many more. He was also instrumental in creating the beloved Tales from the Crypt series in the late 80s and early 90s. Interestingly enough, when they made the Twilight Zone movie in the 80s, this is one of the stories they redid with Jonathan Lithgow, and it is an amazing recreation with modern special effects, and super terrifying, and ratcheted up to 11. It's crazy. You should check it out if you can. I also want to add that if this story seems familiar, even though you've never watched The Twilight Zone, it's because The Simpsons based a story in their Treehouse of Horror series on this episode. It is an amazing and pitch-perfect Season 5 Treehouse of Horror 4 episode called Terror at 5.5 Feet. That Treehouse of Horror episode in and of itself is a parody of Serling's other show, Night Gallery. But in this particular segment, Bart is on the bus, sees the gremlin trying to pop the tire, and of course no one believes him. It's hilarious. It's also one of the episodes of Treehouse of Horror that scared me as a kid a little bit. I think they kind of improve upon the story, as in the end, when Bart is being carted away in the ambulance to go to the insane asylum, the gremlin actually climbs up into the ambulance with Ned Flanders' severed head, and it's gruesome and creepy and weird, and of course he screams, and that's the end of the show. Really great. If you get a chance, check that Simpsons out as well. It may very well be the best of the Treehouse of Horror segments. However, that is an episode for another day. Episode 3, Perchance to Dream. We begin our next episode, with an exhausted, disheveled man standing on the street, staring at a tall building. It is lunchtime, and the city is bustling. Our main character stands out in all of this. Our main character, Ed Hall, is seemingly mesmerized by the comings and goings of people, almost passing out several times. A man approaches him to ask if he is okay. Ed ignores him and enters the building. Inside the building is a doctor's office. The receptionist says they've been expecting him and to go right in. Ed seems as though this is strange, but walks in. He tells the doctor he is exhausted and lies down. He falls asleep almost immediately and then just jerks awake. The doctor seems weirded out and asks why Ed didn't sleep. Ed says he's the tiredest man in the world, having been up 87 hours. Fun fact, the world record for going without sleep is 453 hours and 40 minutes. It is held by Robert MacDonald. That's 18 days and some change. Long-term sleep deprivation is detrimental to your health and is not advised, nor, to my knowledge, still tracked by the world record people as a method of discouraging people from trying it. The doctor asks if he is having trouble sleeping. Ed says he would love to go to sleep, but is convinced that if he does go to sleep, he will die. The doctor offers him a cigarette, and he obliges because this is the 50s and it is illegal not to spark up a lucky strike in a healthcare facility. The doctor takes Ed's claims on face value. Ed was expecting something different. He was expecting to be disbelieved. Ed goes to leave, but the doctor uses some reverse psychology, and Ed folds like a cheap suit. Ed asks the doctor to promise him not to put him in a straitjacket. The doctor, to his credit, says he can't promise anything. Kind of funny, but at least it's honest. Ed begins to stare at a painting of a boat and claims that he is able to make the boat move. The doctor asks all the appropriate questions. Ed gives us some backstory about having a similar picture in his house as a kid. His mother tells him that if he looks at it long enough, it will move. Eventually it did. The doctor says that it was just an optical illusion and is completely normal and understandable. Ed says he knows that, but the problem is, eventually he couldn't control it, and that every time he looked at the painting, it would move. He begins to tell the doctor that this is a problem that, even if there is nothing wrong with him, as long as he believes it, it is still a problem. For an example, if you're convinced your arm hurts, then it hurts, even if there is nothing wrong with it. Ed goes on to say he had other health problems as a kid, including a weak heart, and he should take it easy. However, they didn't factor in his imagination. He'd heard of a woman killed by a man in the backseat of her car. He began to imagine that there was somebody hiding in the back of his car. He'd constantly check his rearview mirror, convinced that the murderer was back there. He knows that he was alone, but at the same time he was terrified his imagination would make the fear real. He ended up crashing the car. The doctors told him his heart would not take another big shock. This is why he can't sleep. The nightmares. Ed reveals his dreams are linear, like the chapters in a book. One dream would continue where the last left off. Eventually, this went away until a week ago. In the dream, he is in a twisted carnival, everything warped and nightmarish. A carnival barker goads him into a shooting game. In the shadows, he sees a display. It's Maya, the cat girl. She is strangely seductive, and pays attention only to Ed. Ed is not so much attracted as nervously hypnotized. He runs away and the woman laughs evilly. He admits he was drawn to her, but at the same time he knew he had to run away. Now farther away, he puts a cigarette in his mouth. A hand from off-screen lights it. It's Maya, the cat girl. Ed is in disbelief. She taunts him, wondering why he ran away from her. He plays along, obviously enthralled. She asks him to follow her. She calls him by name, which he never told her. She tells him not to be afraid. He then begins to tell himself that it's a dream, and Maya replies that she knows this, and begins to lead him away towards the funhouse. That's where she wants to go. Ed pays the man at the ticket booth, and Maya walks into the funhouse. It is filled with skulls, severed heads, and various other creatures. An evil cackling can also be heard while Maya and Ed walk through. In one of the halls, they stop, and Maya says that they've been expecting him. She kisses him, and then the monsters freak Ed out, and he runs. End of dream. Ed tells the doc that he knew right then and there that Maya/the dream was trying to kill him. The doctor tries to calm him and tells him to go on to the next dream. The next dream, Ed was back in the amusement park, this time running. Maya catches up with him, scolding him for running away. After all, this is only a dream. Maya is rather insisting in her delivery and rather demented. She takes him to the roller coaster to get on the ride. He looks around distressed, worried that his heart will give out because of all the excitement and the twists and turns. Maya taunts Ed for being scared, laughing and smiling. He begs her to stop, but she says it's too late. The ride continues and gets faster with even more twists and turns. Maya tells him to jump out. End of dream number 2. Ed is convinced that in the next dream, Maya will push him off the roller coaster, and that will be the end of him. His heart won't be able to take the stress or the shock of the dream. On the other hand, his heart and body, for that matter, won't be able to hold out on the insomnia front much longer either. So, he is a doomed man no matter how you look at it. He goes for the door to get some air and says goodbye to the doctor. Once he gets into the waiting room, he sees behind the reception desk Maya. He goes back into the doctor's office and tells the doc. He then runs to the window and jumps out. In the next scene, the doctor is sitting at his desk. He gets up and calls his secretary, who walks in. It is, in appearance at least, the woman known as Maya. They walk over to the couch, and there lies Ed. The doctor checks Ed's pulse, and he is dead. The receptionist says she doesn't understand, he'd only just come in. The doctor says when he came in, he laid down and immediately fell asleep. Then a second later, he screamed and died. We, the audience, have been witnessing his dream for most of the episode. We just didn't know. This is another episode that doesn't have a morality angle or a lesson. Always a plus for a horror episode, horror for horror's sake. Now don't get me wrong, horror is very often an allegory for a time in history or pop culture, and it holds up a mirror to society. That's great. That's one of the most important and oft overlooked qualities of the genre. I love it, but in the Twilight Zone, often if the story has a moral component, then it's generally not a true horror story. It's a story with elements of horror if it has any horror in it at all. Okay, so, no moral. Our main character, Ed, does not have a history of mental illness like Shatner's character in the previous story. He doesn't have much of a backstory either, but he seems like a regular average Joe kind of guy. The horror element in the story is the same as that of Nightmare on Elm Street. You can't really avoid sleep, at least not for long. Eventually sleep will get you. Be it Freddy or Maya the Cat Lady, as I said before, there are longer-term consequences and complications to extreme sleep deprivation. As Ed said in the story, it doesn't really matter if Maya kills him in the dream, because if he avoids the dream, he's going to die anyway. I mean, imagine not being able to sleep or you will die. Even though you will cling to life and be terrified, eventually the exhaustion and the lull of the nocturnal will catch up with you and be more tempting every second. Think about that night you didn't get any sleep and then had to work. How 2 or 3 hours into the shift felt like you just worked 12. How good it felt to slide your eyelids down over the sandpaper golf balls that used to be your eyes. On those kind of days, of which I've had way too many, I'm not sure I could hold out. It's easy at the beginning, sure, but eventually you lose that battle. Eventually, you want to sleep. You don't care if you get fired, you don't care if you crash your car. You're just so exhausted that your body wants to shut down. How terrifying is it to be in danger of a bodily process so integral and primal as sleep? If this isn't a horror story with a surprisingly dour ending for 1959, I don't know what is. Now, one thing that the episode plays with a little but then lets fade into the background is that of imagination. It is implied that his imagination eventually can make fantasy reality. So, did he imagine the Maya the Cat scenario? I'm not so sold. The nightmare element of the episode seems as though it has its own sinister motive. Perhaps it was Ed's fault that the dream was deadly because he and his strong imagination convinced him it was so. The carnival and the Maya element, but I'm not so sure it wasn't an external malevolent force. They could have implied, as did one of the Twilight Zone reboot episodes from the early 2000s, that he's kind of a hypochondriac with a strong imagination and he can conjure what he's afraid of. So if he gets the suggestion that he's afraid of being eaten by a bunch of ants, that he will manifest that with his powerful imagination. I don't think necessarily that's what's going on here, even though it's an interesting interpretation. I think he just has the dreams that are trying to kill him, and that his imagination has made it worse, but not enabled it. Episode 4, The Living Doll. Next up, we have a story about a little girl and the doll that everybody wants, Talkie Tina. We begin in a normal suburb. A woman and a little girl exit a station wagon. They are holding packages. The little girl's name is Christy. The woman asks her to run up to her room immediately. Christy wants to show her dad, but the mother doesn't think this is a good idea. Telly Savalas of Kojak and James Bond fame is the dad. His name is Eric, and he says hi to the girl as they enter the house. He asks what they bought. The mother seems nervous and says they bought a doll that Christy had been wanting for a while. Eric says she doesn't need a doll. 1 minute and 17 seconds into the episode, and we, the audience, already know that Eric is a huge dick. Christy shows her dad the doll. Her name is Talkie Tina, and she's practically alive and does everything a real girl does. Eric remarks at how much something like this costs, and the mom says she put it on the account. Tina moves and talks and all sorts of stuff. The doll says, "My name is Talkie Tina, and I love you very much." Eric is not charmed and asks how much it cost. Mom is not forthcoming. He presses her. They begin to discuss that Christy is in therapy, and her therapist says she feels rejected by Eric. The doll once again says it's lying, and we hear the mechanisms in the doll working as she moves her arms and head. Eric yells at her to shut it off. Christy runs off up to her room. The mom scolds Eric and runs after her daughter. Tina is on the couch still moving, and Eric makes his way over and inspects the doll. The doll seems to stop and look at him. He winds the key in the back, and she starts again. The doll says, "My name is Talkie Tina, and I don't think I like you." Eric looks puzzled and angry. See, even the doll knows he's a dick. He winds her up again, and the doll once again talks. "My name is Talkie Tina, and I think I could even hate you." Wow, that escalated fast. Eric then throws the doll across the room, to which Talkie Tina replies he'll be sorry. God, hasn't he ever seen one of these things? It's bad enough the doll's trying to kill you. Don't be mean to it. The mother then comes down the stairs and asks why he has to be so cruel. Eric claims he didn't like what the doll said, saying that she has quite a vocabulary. He winds her up and she says, "My name is Talkie Tina and I love you very much." Eric claims that the doll said something different a minute ago. The mom says that she doesn't know how much more of this she can take. His anger towards Christy and his adjusting to her. The mother simply can't let her be treated this way. Eric is only her stepfather, and despite being mean for this entire episode, is offended that it's implied that he doesn't love her. Although he turns this around and makes himself the victim, classic narcissism. It's also implied in the dialogue that Eric is infertile, and of course he's got to be a total douche about it. Unfortunately, the mom falls for it and begins apologizing and asking if he could be better to Christy. Just give it a chance. This is a perfect time for another sarcastic narcissist victim monologue. He's glad he's not some unfeeling monster. I'm the victim, wah wah wah. Mom then takes the bait again and promises that she and Christy will do anything to make him happy and apologizes for having a kid already when he married them. Christy comes down and then apologizes if she made him mad. Eric, for once in this episode, takes the blame and says it's his fault. He seems sincere, he's probably not, but who knows. Talkie Tina is returned to Christy, who goes back upstairs. Later at dinner, Christy is play-feeding Tina her dinner. Eric tells her to eat her own food, and then the doll winks at Eric. He mentions that he didn't know she could do that. Christina says she can't. Mom says Tina will be a good playmate for Christy, and of course that comment was about Eric's non-functioning shriveled genitalia. Eric is mad again because obviously that comment meant something. Eric is mad again because obviously that meant that since Tina can't have a brother or sisters, that Eric is impotent or something. He just oozes insecurity. Mom says that's not at all what she meant, but apologizes anyway. The doorbell rings and Christy goes to the door to play outside with her friend. Mom goes to make sure she's all set, and the doll starts to talk to Eric. "My name is Talkie Tina, and I'm beginning to hate you." Eric stares at the doll angrily. That, in fact, could be an alternate title to this episode, if we're being honest. He gets up from his seat and sits next to the doll and tells her that he is going to get rid of her. Tina replies that he wouldn't dare. The doll tells him his wife and daughter would hate him if he did, as would Talkie Tina herself. Understandably so. Eric is smiling evilly and smugly. He puts a cigarette in his mouth and lights a match. He holds it to Tina's face and she says, "Ow." Eric replies that if Tina has feelings, he can hurt it. Tina tells him she could hurt him. Mom comes in a second later and Eric accuses her of trying to pull one over on him. It's obvious to him that she put a walkie-talkie in the doll and is trying to trick him. She has no idea what he's talking about. She just looks at him like he's nuts. She then claims it's not true, that she's tricking him. She scolds him a little and asks why, if it isn't a conspiracy against him, why the doll doesn't talk to him when she's not in the room. Mom is confused and surprised that he really means it and believes the doll is talking to him. He goes out into the garage and finds the doll sitting on the workbench, moving and looking at him. Eric then walks over to her and tosses her in the garbage can. Tina tells him he is going to be sorry, and then he closes the lid and leaves. The next day, he is on the couch, sitting, eating walnuts for some reason. Christy comes down the stairs and asks if he knows where Tina is, and Eric says he doesn't know where Tina is. They keep asking, but Eric keeps up the charade, pretending he doesn't know. Christy and Mom leave the room and the telephone rings. He answers and hears Talkie Tina. She says, "My name is Talkie Tina and I'm going to kill you." Eric asks how she is on the phone, but it is dead. He hangs up, then goes out to the garage and opens up the trash can to find it empty. He's beginning to sweat now. He stomps back inside and calls Mom downstairs asking where the doll is, and Mom says she hasn't found the doll. Eric says she knows that he put her in the trash can. Obviously, Mom is surprised by this and asks why he would do that. Eric accuses her and Christy once again of playing a prank on him and flies into a rage when she again acts innocent. Eric for a minute begins to believe that perhaps Mom doesn't know anything, and starts thinking about the phone call. He starts to be more afraid, wondering how she could have pulled off the phone call. It wasn't possible, at least not in an easy way, to call from inside the house. Obviously, he's never seen When a Stranger Calls or Black Christmas. He tells Mom that the doll told him it was going to kill him. She looks at him like he's nuts, which she should. Instead of being rational, he then says if it wasn't Mom, it must be Christy's fault. Ah yes, blame the children. Mom is now worried as Eric goes up the stairs to Christy's room. He finds her asleep in bed with Talkie Tina. He is perplexed. He goes into the room further. The doll then opens her eyes and says, "I told you you'd be sorry." Eric takes the doll. Christy wakes up crying and begs him not to take the doll. He says he's taking her, and then to add icing on the douche cake, he says he's not her daddy. Eric takes the doll into the garage where he puts her head in a vise and cranks it. He tells the doll to die, and then the doll tells him that he will die. He cranks the vise more, and her head squishes. He is confused as to why she is not crying in pain. After all, she said she had feelings before. Tina tells him that she can stand this if he can, and giggles. Eric then grabs the blowtorch. He approaches Tina's face with the flame. It blows out every time. More desperate, he wrenches her out of the vise and heads for the saw. He starts to run the saw over her neck, and nothing happens. No marks, no cutting, nothing. Mom comes in and tries to stop him. He throws her away. He then looks back at her neck and finds, again, no marks. Desperate, he puts her in a cloth sack, ties it with rope, and puts her back in the trash can. Tina giggles at this. He adds some cinder blocks to the top for good measure and runs away. Yeah. So, bandsaw didn't work, so we're just going to put her in the trash again with a cloth sack? God. Upstairs, Mom is packing her bags. Eric comes in and asks what she's doing and why. Really seems obvious to me, but the question in the episode seems sincere. Mom says after everything he's done, why the hell wouldn't she leave? He claims he had to. The doll threatened him. Like I said, always the victim. He goes back to the garage and opens a trash can. The doll is still in there, and he unwraps it. She says, "My name is Talkie Tina, and I don't forgive you." He brings the doll back into the house and goes up the stairs and gives the doll back to Christy. Later that night, he is sleeping when he is awakened by the sounds of Talkie Tina's gears whirring. He is startled. Mom wakes too, but says she doesn't really hear anything. He goes out to investigate, all the while hearing the sound. He goes into Christy's room and does not see the doll in bed with her. He looks around and she's not there. As he closes the door to Christy's bedroom, he hears Tina's gears working again. He begins to walk toward the sound down the stairs and steps on Tina, who is on one of the stair treads. He falls down the stairs and breaks his neck. Tina comes tumbling down after him, landing near his face. Eric dies, staring at the doll. The commotion stirs Mom, who comes rushing down the stairs and picks up the doll, who then tells her, "My name is Talkie Tina, and you'd better be nice to me." The end. This is really the boat that launched a million ships. This episode is among the first and certainly most iconic of the killer doll, dummy TV episodes and movies. Without this episode, we wouldn't have Chucky, Annabelle, Megan, demonic toys, Toulon's puppets, the killer dummy movie Magic with Anthony Hopkins, etc. Because of that, this is really an easy one to pick as a horror episode. I don't think I have to convince most people who have seen it. You do have a jerk of a main character and he gets his comeuppance, but still, he runs afoul of a killer doll and the doll kills him. I have seen this episode many times and it's a classic. It was also adapted into an amazing Treehouse of Horror episode, Treehouse of Horror 3. Bart gets a talking Krusty doll that tries to kill Homer. It's hilarious. It's also another one that kind of scared me a little bit when I was a kid, but it's just really funny. That episode also gave us the "that's good, that's bad" Simpsons meme. The episode's pretty straightforward. The doll tries to kill the douchey dad. No real moral to the story except maybe don't be a bad stepfather. Easy to see where you could classify this as a horror episode. I also want to point out that Tina in this episode is voiced by June Foray, who had the most insane voice acting career ever. She started voice acting at age 13 and didn't stop till she was in her 80s. Late 80s. She died at 100. She was the voice of Granny for decades and decades in Looney Tunes cartoons, as well as many, many other voices for those types of cartoons. Rocky and Bullwinkle, ADR for Jaws, Woody Woodpecker, Flintstones. It's insane. May she rest in peace, a true legend. Episode 5, The Hitch-Hiker. This Season 1 episode begins with our main character, Nan. She is by the side of the road having her tire changed. She is driving across country, and the man remarks that going as fast as she was on these roads, she's lucky she didn't die. He asks her to follow him back to town. That's when she sees the hitchhiker, slightly disheveled looking, and standing in the road. She drives past him into town. Once at the service station, she pays the mechanic for helping her with the new tire. She looks into a mirror in her purse and sees the hitchhiker again. She is taken aback. The mechanic asks if anything's wrong, and she says she was just looking at the hitchhiker. The mechanic looks around to see no one. She brushes it off. Maybe he got a ride. She gets back in her car and resumes her journey. A little ways away, she sees him on the other side of the road. Then again later, just standing there. Same guy. She likens his appearance to that of a scarecrow. Now, wherever she stops, wherever she goes, there he is. Nan is terrified and feels that things are wrong. Later in a diner, she asks the cook if they get many hitchhikers in this area, and he says heck no. The roads here have no speed limit, and it's a lot of trucking lanes, and trying to get a ride would be suicide. You'd be more likely to be hit by a car. She mentions to him that she's feeling trapped in her car. She pays and leaves. She comes upon a blocked road where a man stops her. That's when the hitchhiker comes up beside her car and says, heading west? She freaks out and bypasses the blockade. Eventually, she comes across a railroad crossing. There is a train coming through, and she stops. Up ahead, she sees the hitchhiker gesturing to her and guns the engine only to have her car stall on the middle of the tracks. The hitchhiker looks on as she attempts to start her car. The train is barreling down on her. At the last minute, she manages to reverse off the tracks. The hitchhiker is gone after the train is passed. Nan knows now that the hitchhiker wanted her to die on the tracks. She questions whether she should continue heading for New York or go back to where she came from. 3 days of virtually non-stop driving, and still, he constantly appears. Nan begins to get increasingly unhinged. She continues to drive, determined to get where she is going. One night she takes a side road in the middle of nowhere and the car dies. She gets out and stumbles around in the dark. She finds a closed gas station. She begs for help, and the gas station manager tells her to come back in the morning. She tells him about the hitchhiker, and he doesn't care. He simply says if you run into him again, come back to the gas station and tell him. Yeah, that's gonna work. Run into the Zodiac killer and be like, wait a minute, I gotta back to the gas station. You're trying to kill me. Anyway, a hand touches his shoulder, and it's a sailor in a uniform for some reason. He seems nice enough and offers some help. She offers him a ride simply so she won't be alone. He agrees and hassles the gas station owner. They get the gas. He heads back to the car and they fill it with gas. Later they are driving together. She seems better, but still flighty. She runs the story of the hitchhiker by him, trying to make it sound plausible that he could keep catching up with her. He supposes it is possible. She sees the hitchhiker on the side of the road and swerves the car out of the way, freaking out the sailor. She asks if he saw the hitchhiker, but of course he didn't. Nan is convinced that she saw him, and then there he is again, around the next bend. The sailor wrenches the steering wheel out of her hands and demands to drive. Still, he didn't see any hitchhiker. She admits she was trying to kill the hitchhiker so he won't catch up. Sailor Dude has had enough. She begs him to stay and rather unconvincingly hits on him. He doesn't take the bait and leaves. She begs him not to go. Later, she pulls into a diner and goes to use the phone to talk to her mother in New York. Nan is becoming increasingly unraveled. The phone rings in New York and she gets someone named Mrs. Whitney. Mrs. Whitney says that Nan's mother has had a nervous breakdown and is in the hospital. It's happened because of the death of her daughter Nan, who died when her tire blew out while driving across country. Nan walks slowly in a dazed manner in the parking lot. She gets back into her car, looks into the rearview mirror, and in the back of her car, of course, there is the hitchhiker, who then says to her, "I believe you are going my way." The end. If this episode sounds familiar to you, then you might be thinking of a similar themed film from a few years later in 1962 called Carnival of Souls. This movie eventually became a cult classic that means different things to different people. The Rifftrax MST3K crowd will know it because it's one of those fun, cheesy B-movies that they've lampooned. To others, it's a strange, moody, atmospheric indie horror film that blazed a trail, followed by David Lynch and George Romero, etc. I kind of can see the film both ways. It's funny as a relic of its time, but it's got a lot of really cool visuals and a creepy atmosphere. It's not hard to see this as a horror episode. The Grim Reaper-style hitchhiker character stalking Nan, only to find out she's dead, caught in a limbo. Terrifying. Personally, I think the most terrifying element of dying would be to be caught here as a ghost with no answers or direction, wandering the highways. No heaven, no hell, no nothing. Again, it's a weird supernatural ghost episode. Not the scariest of the episodes that I've covered here today, but I think for the most part, you could call this a horror episode. This brings us to the episode that Stephen King called the only true horror episode, The New Exhibit. Now, as I was reading Danse Macabre and he began to say there was only one true horror episode, this is the one that came to mind before it was revealed which one he was talking about. Without going into as much depth as the 5 episodes I just profiled, The New Exhibit follows Martin, a man who works at and gives tours in a wax museum. He always ends each tour the same in the Murderer's Row section. This section features historical serial killers such as Jack the Ripper. In fact, Martin rigged up a foot switch to trigger the Ripper's arm to stab him at the end of the tour, causing the tourists and onlookers to scream and run away. Eventually, Martin's friend, the manager of the wax museum, tells him they are no longer going to be able to keep it open. Martin is totally distressed. He makes arrangements and takes the Murderer's Row wax dummies home with him to keep in his basement. His wife is less than enthused. She is at least a little convinced that Martin intends to find another museum to sell them to. As time goes on, money gets tight, and Martin becomes even more obsessed with the wax figures. He installs an AC so the temperature's perfect in his basement at all times. His wife then attempts to unplug the AC so the wax figures will melt and she can get on with her life. The wax figures come to life and kill her. Martin covers it up as he has thoroughly lost it at this point. The wax figures eventually kill more people, and Martin is blamed. At the end of the episode, we are now in a different wax museum, and all the figures are there, except there's a new one. Martin now has his own wax figure, and has joined the murderer's row. It's a really great episode and a favorite of mine, and usually one of the first ones I think of when I think of the more horror-themed episodes of The Twilight Zone. It's also a bit of a deep-cut episode. Part of the season that saw the show expand to hour-long episodes, which I think was the wrong way to go. Don't get me wrong, the season with the hour-long format does have some great episodes, but I think The Twilight Zone always worked better and best within a tight half-hour time frame, getting in, getting out. I'm guessing eventually the producers felt the same way as for its next and final season, the show went back to being 30 minutes. Other horror episodes I could argue for or could have included would be The Dummy, Caesar and Me, The Midnight Sun, The Howling Man, It's a Good Life, Little Girl Lost, possibly Night Call. Those are the ones I could and would argue as stories that could very well be classified as horror. The thing is, the 6 episodes I reviewed earlier and the additional 7 add up to about 13 horror stories in The Twilight Zone. Now, I've seen a lot of the episodes of the show, but not all of them. And even if there's a few I forgot or have never seen, suddenly realized, hey, this is a horror episode, well, let's round that number up to 15. Let's say there are 15 horror episodes. Problem is that The Twilight Zone was and is an old school show, and TV seasons back then ran about 37 episodes a season. Pretty insane. Quite different from today where you're looking at 8 to 10, maybe 12. That leaves a whole lot of the episodes of The Twilight Zone that were either sci-fi based or morality tales, episodes with robotic grandmas, grieving suicidal elderly professors, a man who finds himself back in time the week of Lincoln's assassination, or some unhappy kids who escape underwater to a kindly grandmother. The Twilight Zone had many interesting tales to tell us. The majority of them, however, were not horror. That was not, however, the aim of this endeavor. The aim of this endeavor was to make my case that Twilight Zone had several noteworthy horror episodes, more than one at least. Even if you didn't agree with all of my picks, I would venture to say that at least one of them you saw eye to eye with me on. So overall, The Twilight Zone is indeed a morality play wrapped in sci-fi fantasy. However, occasionally, that signpost up ahead, that dimension of not only sight and sound but of mind, known as the Twilight Zone, would occasionally be a journey through horror. Act 2, The Eulogy. Rod Serling was already a fixture of television by the time he developed and worked on The Twilight Zone. Prior to The Twilight Zone, he was in the 11th Airborne in World War II. While still in the Army, he began a boxing career. Apparently he was quite scrappy and a berserker boxer, but nothing of that line of work ever materialized for him. He would just go in heavy and hard and always break his nose. In World War II, he saw some shit. He was a contradiction of a soldier. In one way, he was said not to be fit for battle. However, there are other stories of him risking his life without a second thought. He would occasionally wander off and go exploring on his own, which is, a bad idea when you're behind enemy lines. But he was also brave and heroic, at the same time saving other people's lives. He was wounded in battle several times and walked out of fights that had a 50% casualty rate. He was decorated at the end of the war. He was also disillusioned and traumatized. He took to writing to deal with it. He also took to chain smoking, unfortunately, something that would ultimately lead to his demise. Any Twilight Zone fan will recognize Serling's attempting to make sense of the darker nature of man, war, prejudice. Serling would have nightmares and flashbacks for the rest of his life as a result of fighting in World War II. As I said before, I also credit Serling's chain smoking as another coping mechanism for having PTSD. Serling was a pillar of early television. He had cut his teeth working and writing for radio. He eventually moved to television work because A, it was the new burgeoning technology, and B, Serling considered radio to have squandered its potential and had a nasty habit of playing to the lowest common denominator. Serling became quite successful in writing live broadcast televised plays, basically movies shot and acted live and in sequence. This culminated in a film starring Anthony Quinn titled Requiem for a Heavyweight, a boxing movie live on TV. Serling continued to progress and try to push the envelope. He pitched some stories to the network that dealt frankly and honestly about civil rights struggles of the time. CBS was all for it as long as he took out all the racial and civil rights stuff. Maybe just some opening credits and a title card, and then nothing. Maybe more ads, smoke some cigarettes, that kind of thing. He began to get tired of censorship and fighting. He stumbled upon the idea of masking these ideas and issues in science fiction, finding that, as I covered earlier, TV executives didn't get the broader message if it was a green alien being racist to a blue alien. Twilight Zone went on the air in 1959. A lot of the stories were written, or at least adapted, by Serling himself, especially in the first season. The show, although well-received, took a lot out of him, and he was exhausted by the time it was done. It would be canceled and revived a few times during its 5-year run, something I didn't know until I was prepping to make this show. He was also the host and the face of the show. As he pointed out in some interviews, he got the blame if the episodes were good, and he also got the blame if the episodes were bad. Didn't matter if he wrote them or not, he was the face of it. He was the presenter. That wasn't so bad on the Twilight Zone itself because he had a lot of creative control, but years later, on the more horror-focused show Night Gallery, Serling did not nearly have as much creative input, which was his design. He wanted to take a step back while still having a TV show. However, many people saw and assumed incorrectly that the Night Gallery stuff was written by him, or at least the show was controlled by him much more than it actually was. After The Twilight Zone, Serling would go on to write the classic film Planet of the Apes. I was surprised when I first heard this, but it makes sense when you think about the ending and the whole vibe of that kind of story. He would teach writing at Antioch and Ithaca colleges, appear in commercials, and such in the 60s and 70s. In 1975, he would die as a result of a heart attack. By then, he was smoking 3 to 4 packs of cigarettes a day. If you can find the American Masters special from 1995 submitted for your approval, Rod Serling, I highly recommend it. I caught it randomly as a rerun on PBS a long time ago, and it was a really wonderful look at the man and his legacy. It wasn't 1995 when I saw it, but PBS has a lot of those types of shows that they'll run once or twice for a weekend and then never show again for 20 years, if ever. When looking at the Twilight Zone, you have a lot of great options for episodes. It is sometimes hard to pick a favorite. Do you pick a haunting, sentimental, nostalgia, bittersweet story like Walking Distance or In Praise of Pip? Do you go aliens invading like To Serve Man, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, or The Invaders? Perhaps something stranger like The Howling Man or The Living Doll? It was a while into my Twilight Zone fandom when I discovered that if I picked 10 favorite episodes, the majority of them were written by 3 men, Rod Serling, Richard Matheson, and Charles Beaumont. Matheson and Beaumont were responsible for some of the best Twilight Zone episodes, and these 3 men really defined and made the show what it was, the cohesive energy of it. Matheson has written a ton of stuff over the years, including I Am Legend, which has been adapted a bunch, once in the 60s with Vincent Price, then again as the Omega Man with Charlton Heston in the 70s, and then the one with Will Smith a few years back, which is getting a legacy sequel soon, as of the release of this podcast. He also wrote a bunch of Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe adaptations in the 70s. A little later, films such as What Dreams May Come with Robin Williams, Real Steel with Hugh Jackman, and Stir of Echoes with Kevin Bacon, to name a few. As for The Twilight Zone, Matheson wrote Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, Little Girl Lost, Nick of Time, and The Invaders. All great episodes. Charles Beaumont was much like Matheson, a gifted writer for the bizarre and the strange. He unfortunately died young and, towards the end of his life, wound up working with ghostwriters to develop his scripts. He was 34 when he died, but had a well-lauded career as a writer nonetheless. Even when he was writing scripts with ghostwriters, he would insist that they got 50% of his royalties and money for the script. Beaumont's Twilight Zone contributions include The Living Doll, The Howling Man, Shadow Play, Dead Man's Shoes, and The New Exhibit, to name a few. It's easy to say that the backbone of the Zone was Serling, Matheson, and Beaumont. Without these 3 men, Twilight Zone would not exist. But if it did exist without them, we wouldn't be talking about the Twilight Zone today. It would simply be an old show lost to time. Think about it. How many shows from the 1950s, even a decade or two later, are we still talking about? Not many. I Love Lucy, Twilight Zone, those are really the only two that I can think of that people still reference today in one way, shape, or form. There were many other shows on the air at that time, and for whatever reason, I'm sure reruns played a part of it. Twilight Zone lived on because of its great ideas, because of its execution, because of it being ahead of its time. I Love Lucy was groundbreaking for other reasons. It was hilarious, but this is not an I Love Lucy podcast, so we'll move on. Both those shows, however, lived on in reruns and continue to this day. That's our podcast for this week. Be sure to tune in next time for Horror Beneath the Surface. I have been your host, Professor Terror, otherwise known as Mark. Thanks for listening. Stay scared.